Good morning, everybody. Now it's time to present our last invited speaker to the Symposium of Principles, Philosophy, Methodology, and Methodology of Phylogenetic Systematics. He is the Professor Taran Grant. He lives and works in Brazil, where he is a professor in the University of Sao Paulo in the Department of Zoology and associate curator in the Museum of Zoology. His first interest is the evolution of amphibian diversity, and his research in systematics focuses on amphibian and the philosophical underpinnings of phylogenetic inference. He is going to answer questions in English, Spanish, and Portuguese. So please send your questions on the chat. And Professor Grant, thank you very much for being here. You may start whenever you are ready.
Okay, Edgar, thank you. There we go, and share the screen. This is also awkward. There, is that working? I hope so.
Yeah,
I have no way of knowing if it's not. Oh, good, okay. Bueno, antes de empezar, quiero agradecer a los organizadores y quiero pedir disculpas también, porque la verdad, ayer entraron en contacto para preguntar si podía dar la charla hoy en español, y yo les dije que no, porque básicamente mi cabeza no se enreda demasiado si tengo las diapositivas en inglés y hablo en español o en portugués. Entonces, pido disculpas, pero voy a hacer la charla en inglés y después, como dijo Edgar, puedo responder preguntas en español o portugués también. Entonces, cambiando el chip para English again. So, outgroup sampling and phylogenetics. This talk is going to be much less technically sophisticated than the other talks that were given in this symposium, but I think it's no less fundamental. In fact, the reason that I was drawn to this question and why I wanted to present this today is that in my experience, especially with students, one of the most challenging aspects of designing a phylogenetic study, sort of in boots on the ground, doing systematics research, is figuring out what to include in the outgroup sample. And I think that the main reason why that's so challenging is that the scientific basis for outgroup sampling has been either poorly or inadequately articulated in the literature. And so that's what I wanted to try and address in this talk, if I can. So outgroup sampling is an aspect of taxon sampling, which is the selection of terminals that are included in an analysis. And that, in turn, is an aspect of the sampling design of a phylogenetic study. And so the other aspect of this, of course, would be character sampling, where we have the choice of loci, whether we're going to use molecular data, morphological data, behavioral data, whatever, and then taxon sampling. So taxon sampling by convention is divided into the in-group and the out-group. The in-group is the putative clade composed of terminals whose relationships are the primary focus of study. And there's really, in terms of sampling the in-group, there's consensus that because that's our primary focus of interest, that we should maximize the sampling there. And so most of our resources are spent trying to populate that sample as much as we can. And the outgroup then is the complement of the in-group. And the reason that we perform this sampling of the outgroup, at least the way this is normally put forth, is to be able to perform outgroup comparison. So outgroup comparison is a method to root or direct the topology and thereby polarize characters. And what this does is it transforms a network of abstract connections into a theory of concrete evolutionary events. So if we look at this image that I put here, we have the undirected network on the left, I guess it is. And if terminal Z or Z, the Canadian is Z, is our root, then we would root on that. And that's what turns that undirected network into a historical diagram that shows events of transformation. This is not the only method of rooting. There's also midpoint rooting. There's use of the ontogenetic criterion, generality criterion. There's paleontological criterion. There's the precept of common equals primitive. And in the earlier literature, this was discussed a lot. A few examples of references can be found at the bottom of this slide. And what emerged from that debate and where we are really now is that outgroup comparison is the predominant means of rooting and polarizing characters. how we sample the outgroup is governed largely by practical considerations. And so, like I said, with the in-group, the objective really is to maximize that as sample as densely as possible. For the outgroup, we are concerned with availability of specimens and tissues, resources for field, lab, and computation. And we, I think, appropriately focus mostly on maximizing that in-group sample. And what we find in empirical studies is somewhere between 75 and 99% or more of the taxon sampling is focused on the in-group, and somewhere between 0.01 and 25% will be the outgroup. The problem we have, though, is that there are lots and lots of data available online that are publicly available. So most obvious would be GenBank, but there are plenty of others as well. And so there's plenty of data out there that we can include as our outgroup. And on top of that, we know that truly massive, incredibly massive analyses can be done. So I think probably the best example is Goldbach et al. From 2009, so now over a decade ago, where they thoroughly analyzed over 73,000 terminals in their analysis. And so that leads to problems, basically, if you're working on, for example, a genus of frogs. Do I have to include everything? That seems like scientifically that might be the most appropriate thing to do. On the other hand, it seems intuitive that that would be overkill. And beyond that, it also means that most of the human and computer work would be focused on parts of the tree that are so distant from my group of interest that they're absolutely irrelevant. So if that's the case, and we don't need to include everything, and in fact, if we shouldn't include everything because that would be detrimental to our analysis, what are the selection criteria for including outgroup terminals in our analysis? And what would the basis be for limiting that sample size? And so although there's been discussion about the selection criteria in the literature, some of that at least, there's been pretty much nothing on what the basis for limiting that sample size should be. So that's what I'm looking at. So if we look at empirical studies, for the most part, what we find are phrases that are like I've got here. So I don't mean to pick on these studies. They're absolutely fine studies. There's no intended criticism here. These are basically just a random sample of empirical studies where they say the outgroup selection was based on, and then they have a list of sort of fairly general and vague criteria, such as based on the phylogeny published by so-and-so, based on the morphological data, things like that, but without ever saying exactly what the specific reasons were for choosing those terminals. And also what the reasons were for not choosing other terminals, including terminals that were included in the studies that were cited, that could have been included. And if we go to the theoretical literature, there really isn't a whole lot of help either. The most influential and important of the papers that have been published on outgroups would be this one here, On Outgroups, by Kevin Nixon and Jim Carpenter from 1993, so quite a while ago now. And in there, they include several selection guidelines that are proposed basically as rules of thumb. So one would be to select one or more terminals based on more inclusive synapomorphy shared with the in-group. Number two would be select the sister of the in-group if possible. Not necessary, but if possible, include it. And generally, the denser samples are better than sparser ones. If more inclusive synapomorphies are unknown, then choose on the basis of previous classifications or similarity. And these are really what I think have guided most of outgroup selection since then. Problems here are that there are no theoretical justifications for these guidelines. So it really they were proposed as rules of thumb. And especially there are no guidelines for limiting the size of the outgroup sample. And again, this is not intended as a criticism here. This paper was published in a time where we didn't have these databases with all these data that were available. And so it was really aimed at a very different sort of problem. There have been a number of studies of the effects of outgroup sampling, both using empirical data and simulation data. And so the procedures in these studies are generally something along the lines of simulating random sequences to identify random roots, substituting outgroup terminals, so taking one out, replacing it with another, outgroup subsampling. So if you have a larger outgroup, then something like that, or outgroup expansion, so including additional outgroup taxon, seeing what the effect is on the inferences. The effects that have been found vary a lot across these different studies, but in general, you find that changing the outgroup sample can affect in-group monophyly, it can change the root position, it can affect support values. So it matters basically what you choose in your outgroup, what you select matters. It's been found that random outgroups join the longest in-group terminal branch. Simulations have found that a single distant outgroup terminal can result in an incorrect root, result in rearranging the in-group topology. It's been found in simulations too that 2 outgroup terminals can be better than 1, but the greatest accuracy can be with 0 outgroup terminals. And so there are some things that have been published on this, but these studies really, although they help understand methods and are extremely useful in that regard, in terms of designing a specific study, an empirical study, they're of limited utility. And so another approach is to look at it from a slightly different perspective. And in any event, these studies here all focus on this question of outgroup sampling in terms of accuracy being correct. So finding the correct or appropriate or suitable outgroup terminals to increase accuracy or reliability and avoid incorrect tree topologies by preventing errors such as long branch attraction and incorrect routing. And all this is consistent with the view that phylogenetic systematics aims to accurately or reliably perform phylogenetic reconstruction. And in some general sense, that's of course what we're all interested in. But for those who view accuracy and reliability as being outside the purview of science, specifically, a research program that incessantly searches for magic bullets and golden rules is destined for failure. And so the other approach that I think is useful for looking at this is to look at what the scientific objectives of outgroup comparison would be. And so what guides me in looking at this is, I think what we can all largely agree is the aim of science, which is testing hypotheses. And although the logic of scientific discovery is usually discussed in terms of Popper, who tried to formalize this, and that leads to a lot of debate as to what the success or failure of his program was. The idea really goes way before him. And so here's a quote from John Stuart Mill from a century before Popper, which is, there's the greatest difference between presuming an opinion to be true because with every opportunity for contesting it, it has not been refuted, and assuming it's truth for the purpose of not permitting its refutation. So really the objective is to try to refute something, and if you are unable to refute it, then we accept that as at least a true model for moving forward. So again, the idea here would be to try to refute hypotheses and to do so as severely as possible. So the objectives of phylogenetic inference generally would be to formulate and test phylogenetic explanations as severely as possible. This maximizes explanatory power. The way that we perform a test is by analyzing evidence, which is defined as empirical observations that are through causal relationship are logically capable of refuting hypotheses. And the greater the probability, based on everything that we know, the greater the probability before running our analyses that the evidence will refute the hypothesis that we're trying to test, the severer the test. And so that's what we're trying to do, is get the strongest evidence possible to test our hypotheses. And all of that is fairly non-controversial in philosophy of science. So focusing on phylogenetic explanations then, which are these hypotheses or these explanations we're trying to test. These are compound explanations that are composed of 2 classes of hypotheses. So we have hypotheses of cladogenetic events, which we discuss in terms of monophyly, topology, cladistic distance. And also, so the other side of this coin will be hypotheses of character state transformation events. And so it's all in terms of events. And in this particular class of hypotheses is about homology, transformation, synapomorphy, branch length, patristic distance. And these together are what form phylogenetic explanations. And the evidence that we bring to bear is composed of independently heritable characteristics that form transformation series, which we discuss in terms of character states and characters. And so the objective of taxon sampling, with all this in mind, is to test hypotheses of in-group topology and homology, so both of these. And given that both in-group and out-group characters are logically capable of refuting hypotheses of in-group topology and homology, the inclusion of out-group terminals increases the severity of test and explanatory power. Basically, by including these things that are outside of our in-group, we are more severely, more rigorously testing our in-group hypotheses. So what are the criteria then, with that sort of background, for choosing what terminals we should include? The overarching guideline would be choose the taxa that you think are most likely to refute your in-group hypotheses, and that refers both to the topology and homology. So the minimum requirement for this is to include more than one outgroup terminal. A single outgroup, which is chosen as the root, is incapable of resulting in refutation of the in-group monophyly, and so you're not testing that. And also it is incapable of identifying or refuting, therefore, synapomorphies for the in-group. So it's unable to distinguish between synapomorphies of the in-group and odd apomorphies of the root terminal. So that's why you need to have more than one. Beyond that, there are phylogenetic criteria. So the most obvious of these would be cladistic proximity. The closer to the in-group, the more likely it is that it would either fall inside the in-group when you analyze these new data, or that it would at least have an effect on root placement and character transformations. And with that in mind, then the most pleasing morphic terminals from the sister group will be most critical. But we know also through empirical studies that even distantly related taxa can cause sort of a ripple effect through the phylogeny, which can also affect the in-group hypotheses. And so the closer the better, but further away can be important too. And I'll get to that in a second. And the other one is to use support, which would, in this case, you include terminals that are from regions of low support, and that might seem sort of counterintuitive, but the idea is that if something is poorly supported, if its placement is poorly supported, then it will potentially jump around in additional hypotheses, and that can result in it either being placed inside or very close to your in-group and have a disproportionate effect. And then beyond that, there are non-phylogenetic criteria, so sort of more just intuitive criteria, all of which are valid when it comes to choosing what you think is going to possibly refute your in-group hypotheses. So using taxonomy, using shared character states, geographic distribution, whatever empirical basis you have for thinking that something might be a strong test of your in-group hypotheses, it's worth including. Now, although this provides a basis for preferentially selecting taxa, it does not provide a basis for stopping. So if you keep on applying this, eventually you'll get to the 73,000 taxa that are in Goluboff's analysis. And so as an ancillary approach to this, I propose doing what's called successive outgroup expansion. So basically repeating this until you reach in-group stability. So start with a selection of outgroup terminals, run your analysis, and then identify what are the key areas of your topology that need to be targeted more severely, and include additional outgroup terminals. Run the analysis again, see what changed, and run it again until you get to stability. A disclaimer of this is that this procedure does not ensure that inclusion of even more outgroup terminals will not refute your in-group hypotheses. So more evidence is always better scientifically, and stopping at any point is arbitrary. But this is merely an empirical basis to objectively conclude a given research cycle. And so briefly, I want to show an example of this, an empirical example of this. So this is the poison frogs, superfamily Dendrobacteria. And within this, we've got this little clade here called, that I refer to as the ADO clade, which is the Adelphobates, Dendrobates, and Oophaga clade. And the topology within this clade varies among different analyses. And so you either have Dendrobates and Oophaga being sister taxa, or Adelphobates and Dendrobates being sister taxa. And so what I did is I performed an initial selection, which was focused just on the subfamily Dendrobatinae. It includes the two potential sister groups of this ADO clade. Run that analysis, see my support values. I see here that there's a low support value here, 5, which are circled. Over in the corner, I've shown the number of in-group terminals, the number of out-group terminals, the number of most parsimonious trees, the number of steps. I then expanded this, and I don't have time to go into the detail of what the rationale was for these expansions, but I expanded it to now have 16 outgroups, same topology. But then when I expand up to 24 outgroups, this topology changes. And so the placement now, I have Adelphobates and Dendrobates as being sister taxa, with Oophaga being excluded. Expand additionally, and then expand more, and that relationship is upheld. And if I even expand beyond this, basically what I find is that this result is insensitive to additional outgroup sampling based on these data. And that provides a stopping point. And so with that, my time is up. And so just to summarize, the overarching sort of guideline would be to choose the taxa that are most likely to refute your hypotheses of in-group topology and homology, and to expand that outgroup sample until reaching your group stability. And that provides an empirical basis for stopping in any particular analysis. And so with that, Thank you, gracias, obrigado. Thank you very much to the organizing committee. And if there are any questions, if anyone's out there, I'll be happy to take them.
Lindo!
Woo!
Yay! Leaf. Is it Canadian? I don't know. I'm trying my best.
It looks like a maple leaf. It's close enough.
I'm clapping because the audience can't. I will leave Edgar to manage the questions if there are any. Everyone, please type your questions to Taran using the chat. And Edgar is going to help us managing all of them.
Puede ser español o portugués também.
Yeah, your questions can be in Portuguese, Spanish, or Portuguese. Podem fazer perguntas em português, espanhol ou inglês. Podem ser perguntas em inglês, espanhol ou português. Whatever you like the best. Edgar, do you want to read this?
Yeah, it's okay. Well, first of all, I want to say thank you, Professor Grant. It was an exciting talk, and definitely it's going to make us think twice before choosing our outgroup in our next phylogenetic analysis. Well, here we have a question of Mario de Pina, who is asking, Mario de Pina, what to do when you are getting close to the root of life and there is nowhere else to go?
So in terms of, that's one of the long-standing questions. I mean, the point here basically is that if you're dealing with all life, there's nothing to root on. And in that case, there are, and personally, I find the generality criterion is probably most compelling. But for the vast majority of us, that's just not a question. You know, most phylogenetic studies that are done are dealing with, you know, in Mario's case, they're dealing with a group of fishes, or in my case, with a group of frogs, or, you know, a group of viruses, or whatever it is. And in those cases, there are always things that have been sampled that you can look at. And so there's that one case study, which I agree that's a very hard nut to crack, and I do not pretend to have an answer to it, because it hasn't affected my own empirical research. So I know that's an incredibly unsatisfying answer, but
Thank you. But if I may interject, your proposal of selection of outgroups, you have a criteria of when to stop adding new outgroups, correct?
Yeah. Oh, was that a question?
I was pointing out that it was a question that was very poorly phrased. So you do have a criteria. Would you like to review what the criteria is, please? Sorry.
Yeah. So the criterion for stopping adding would be to basically to have a criterion for in-group stability in the in-group hypotheses, right? And so that would be looking, most obviously, we would be looking at the topology of the in-group, and when that stops changing, when you add additional outgroup taxa, then that's a point for stopping. So what exactly the criterion is for when you stop? I mean, minimally, you would require 2 expansions with no change. Empirically, we may find that 2 expansions is not enough, and we may want to do more, but that would be, logically, that's the minimum that we require. In terms of character optimizations, that's a lot more difficult to assess the stability. And so with that, you can use proxies such as branch length, things like that. In most cases, we are primarily interested in I think, the topology. But in general, the goal would be to expand at least twice without the hypotheses of interest of your in-group changing. Perfect. And I think that's the most important aspect of this, rather than providing or proposing a definitive solution to this, is to see outgroup sampling more as something that's done dynamically. Normally, what we do with phylogenetic studies is we have our in-group taxa, which we don't mess with once we've chosen them, and that makes sense because we've maximized that sample, right? We've chosen as many as we can to test our hypotheses, and then we choose almost at random or with minimum criteria a set of some outgroup taxa, and then we run our analysis. And we might do all kinds of things with alignments and all kinds of things with model selection, all kinds of things with our data, but we never, in the vast majority of cases, we never go back to our outgroup sample and see what impact that might be having on our inferences. And so I think this provides a scientific basis for looking at that and for making decisions once you've seen that your in-group is sensitive to outgroup sampling. And basically, once it stops being sensitive to outgroup sampling, then you kind of check that off and move on.
Well, thank you. Here we have another question. This one comes from Martin Ramirez. And he's asking,
Martin,
what is your strategy when the outgroup phylogeny is already densely sampled?
sorry, can you say it again, Edgar? It broke up.
What is your strategy when the outgroup phylogeny is already densely sampled?
When the outgroup is already densely sampled, see if I understand this. So if it's already densely sampled and it's still unstable, would be the thing. So I guess it's hard to tell because this is the question that was already posed. So if you've already densely sampled your outgroup, you've included everything that you think is relevant, and it's still your in-group is still unstable, I would say continue moving outward. You can always, there's always, unless you've included all 73,000 that were in the Golubov paper or more, then there's always additional outgroup sampling. That said, if you get to, we have to be practical as well. And so if you get to a point where you've done a lot of analysis, then that can be one of your conclusions, right, of the study, is that although my in-group results are sensitive to outgroup sampling, and that's something that additional, future research needs to look at more.
And Martin Ramirez has clarified that his question is in the context of, and I quote here, your small sample may show contradictory topology of what is already known.
So your small, by that you mean the small sample, the small outgroup sample shows it results in contradictions of in-group topology. In that case, expand the outgroup sample. That would be,
and what if you have like a large outgroup sample, but a small in-group sample?
Oh, a large outgroup sample and small in-group sample. And the outgroup topology is variable?
Or the topology in general is maybe our in-group is still varying from what is currently known. So
so if the in-group is still varying, then it shows that there's in-group sensitivity to the outgroup sampling. And then I would say, again, continue sampling until it becomes stable. If it's the outgroup sample that's variable, which happens all the time, my argument is that that's irrelevant in this particular case, because that's not the focus of the study. And so the focus of the study, the reason for performing outgroup comparison is to compare the in-group to the outgroup. And if you've redefined what your in-group is, basically, because now you're no longer, in my own case, I'm no longer interested in dendrobated frogs, now I'm interested in all Anura, because I see that Anura is changing, well, then I've got to expand, my outgroup is now changed. And so it's basically, there's a slippery slope as to what the definition of your in-group would be then. Which is why I think it's so important in the setup to papers, is to specify clearly what your question is, and define the in-group so that you can appropriately sample the outgroup. But outgroup topology, in my view, is, because that's not what the basis of the sampling, that's not your objective of sampling, is irrelevant per se. Because the in-group sample is what you're interested in.
Okay, here we have another question from Gilberto Bergamo, who says, "Hi Taran, great presentation. Is there any difference in including multiple species from a same group as outgroups, or one species at a time in each testing run?"
So it all depends on, the question is basically, and as you can tell by how I'm sort of hedging here, I don't have a good answer for that, because I think it's an empirical question. I think every data set is going to be different. In general, I think that there's two things that we can kind of do. We can either go denser sampling within groups that we've already sampled, or further away from the root of our group. And both of those are legitimate strategies for increasing sampling. In my own work, what I do is, when I do an expansion, I do both of those. So I look at the close groups and I see what the support values are in there. And if the support values are low, then I think, okay, this is definitely something that I should target more thoroughly. And I also try to expand further away from the root. But I think that if more people look at outgroup sampling dynamically, or as a sort of a sampling question like this, rather than as just a static, I take one group of taxa and analyze, I think that we'll have a much better idea of sort of a general rule of thumb as to where we should go with that. So if it's, right now we just don't have the data because very few people are looking at outgroup sampling in this way.
Okay, we have much questions, so I don't know if I would like to ask to Dennis if we have more time.
Oh, sure, yeah, I send a reminder to everyone that our poster session has started, but as long as our speaker, the famous Professor Taran Grant, allows us to keep plugging him, we will continue with the questions and answers. And I asked for the UNC Charlotte people to allow us a few more minutes for us to keep going because we have a lot of great questions.
I'm happy to just know that there are people out there because, I mean, from what I can see, I see me, Dennis, and Edgar. So.
Oh no, so they're not. There are only 92 people that decided that this is interesting and they are still watching. Plus other people that are in the same room watching together. So you are cool. Wow. I will read a question by, and I don't have a name. I have an email. It's Stefan.Richer. Well, I guess that's the name. Stefan.Richer by Rostock. Oh, I know you.
Hi. People I know.
I am wondering if in morphological analysis, also the number of inapplicables in the outgroup would be a criterion. If all characters are inapplicable in the outgroup, it wouldn't work.
Yeah, if all characters are inapplicable in the outgroup, yeah, that's absolutely a consideration. For most of the time, when this is relevant, is when we're dealing with molecular data, because those are the data sets that are the databases that have the most data that people can access. So things like GenBank, and in those cases, that's not an issue. But yeah, for morphological characters, absolutely.
Edgar, would you mind reading this question in Spanish by Guillermo?
Yeah, no problem. Él pregunta, dejando de lado el tiempo de análisis, ¿qué problema habría en usar como outgroup el resto del árbol de la vida?
Mira, el principal serían dos cosas. Uno sería el tiempo que yo necesito para organizar los datos, básicamente. Porque formatación de los datos para diferentes programas puede ser un caos. Entonces, y fuera de eso, realmente el principal sería simplemente el tiempo de análisis. Análisis no apenas del análisis de los árboles, sino también del alineamiento. Y el alineamiento puede ser, dependiendo del abordaje, puede ser muy demorado también. Pero lo principal sería eso.
So, si no tenemos estas restricciones, I cannot speak Spanish. So if we don't have those restrictions, keeping aside computational restrictions and your personal time on analyzing the data, in an ideal, imaginary, utopic scenario, there would be no restrictions.
Exactamente. Voy a parafrasear eso en español. Si no hubiera restricciones en recursos, donde recursos sería computacional, tiempo, etcétera, lo ideal siempre sería analizar absolutamente todo, bajar todos los datos, analizar todo. Científicamente sería lo más riguroso, sin duda. Porque es un análisis que incluye más evidencia, y cuanto más evidencia, más fuerte.
Okay, the next question is, how do you choose outgroup with fossil data when you don't have close relatives to your in-group?
Cool. Just let me understand. This is an empirical study that would be involved. You're working with a group of frogs, and there's a fossil that's. I guess what I'm wondering is this asking about the paleontological criterion for outgroup for rooting, or is this?
Yeah, he's
just including fossils with recent animals.
Well, I understand that he works, or at least the question is for a person that works with fossils and they don't have like close relatives to choose an outgroup, so they want to know.
Yeah, no, choose the closest that you can. That's the only thing that I can say. Include the closest ones you can. There's no, I mean, this is one of the things that Nixon and Carpenter paper was so important about all those years ago, is that one of the aims of that was to sort of debunk myths around outgroup comparison. And one of them is that you need to have, at the time you need to have the sister group included in order to perform outgroup comparison. And you don't. So we do the best that we can with the empirical data that we have available. And so, you know, in the case of a fossil group where there's nothing that's very close, then you include the closest things you can. And we understand that that might, you know, be wrong, but everything in science might be wrong. And so we make the arguments and do the best that we can with what we have.
Antes do Edgar passar para as próximas, eu só queria dar uma mensagem rápida para não esquecer. O Mário de Pina falou, muito obrigado, fantástica palestra. Martina said, buona charla, Taran. Edgar, what's the next question?
Yeah, the next question is there another escape or rule for morphology studies? So the characters from species that get more and more distant to the study species don't turn impossible to compare?
Is that no? Unfortunately, no. I mean, that with morphology, it's a matter of sitting down and figuring out what the relationships are. I mean, eventually, what will happen, presumably, is that we'll understand the genetic basis for all the phenotype, and then the phenotype will basically not enter into phylogenetic analyses because that will already be coded in the entire genomes that we're analyzing completely. Unfortunately, we're very far away from analyzing entire genomes, except for things like, you know, viruses and bacteria and things like that. And so, you know, we're a long way from that. But no, unfortunately, inapplicables is, I mean, there's two aspects of inapplicables. There's inapplicables that are, you know, because the structure just is gained or lost, and there's inapplicables because you're looking at, you know, taxa that are so far away, right? The sponges and frogs.
Yeah, Dennis, could you help me with the next question?
Claro. Temos uma pergunta da fantástica Viviana Morim. Ela diz o seguinte. Obrigada pela palestra. Excelente. É problemático escolher espécies irmãs representando uma cladogênese como o outgroup? Falo duas espécies do mesmo gênero.
Perdão, Denis, perdi a primeira parte.
Claro, de novo. É problemático escolher espécies irmãs representando uma cladogênese como outgroup? Ou seja, é problemático fazer essa escolha de outgroup quando ela está falando de duas espécies do mesmo gênero?
Não, nenhum problema. Eu não incluiria apenas essas duas espécies. Você imagina que está pensando num caso em que tem o grupo irmão do grupo interno e aí tem as duas espécies. Incluir essas duas. Agora, o problema seria só incluir apenas essas duas, aí teria que escolher uma dessas como a raiz, né? Ou teria que escolher enraizar embaixo dessas duas. Nas duas casos, você tem um problema de inferência das sinomorfias para o grupo interno. Então, nesse caso, seria melhor escolher, se por algum motivo só tem a possibilidade de incluir duas espécies, dois terminais, seria incluir uma dessas espécies e mais uma que está mais fora. Enraizar em uma das outras. Mas, na verdade, isso seria bom como um ponto de partida, possivelmente, para uma análise filogenética, mas provavelmente os resultados do grupo interno seriam muito suscetíveis a variações ou muito dependentes dessa seleção do grupo externo. Então, aí, o ideal, na minha opinião, seria uma expansão e ver o que acontece. E provavelmente vai mudar as relações internas. E continuar fazendo isso, então, até chegar na estabilidade.
Obrigado.
E basicamente, essa pergunta é muito boa, porque é uma das perguntas típicas que a gente enfrenta, que é, beleza, eu tenho essa situação aqui, eu pego as duas, pego uma delas, como é que eu faço? E eu acho que se a gente consegue tornar essa pergunta uma pergunta empírica e não uma pergunta teórica, na teoria não temos resposta realmente. Se a gente torna isso uma pergunta empírica, onde a gente testa o impacto, basicamente, de incluir essas duas, e mais, aí a gente fortalece as nossas inferências filogenéticas.
Perfeito. I'm sorry if I'm butchering this person's name. Mermin Mikkel Mentin. I'm Brazilian, guys. If I'm getting some names wrong, I'm so sorry.
My name is Taran Grant. My name is Taran. No one can pronounce my name properly.
What should be the ideal outgroup characters to be considered when doing phylogenetic analysis with fossil records? So with the fossil record, are there any specific outgroup characters that are in some way preferable to be used?
Let me understand outgroup characters or characteristics of the outgroups?
Ideal outgroup
characters per se.
characters.
So transformation. I think no, I don't think so. I think include everything. I don't think that there's my own view about the objectives of science is that we include all the evidence that's available. So if there's a particular reason for rejecting a particular observation or class of evidence or something like that, that's fine. But in the absence of a criterion of a basis for rejecting some piece of evidence, include all the evidence. And so, the only caveat, I guess, or clarification that I would put is that it has to be evidence that's relevant to your in-group hypotheses. Now, that might be evidence that is important for positioning taxa in the outgroup. So, inapplicables, for example, they're not applicable within your in-group, but those would help with, or those are necessary for testing hypotheses of the outgroup, then you would include those characters. But in general, as long as you're testing hypotheses related to your in-group, then it's appropriate.
Agora, enquanto o Edgar me ajuda... Sim, muito obrigado. Enquanto o Edgar me ajuda a ver se perdemos alguma pergunta, I have a question from myself in Portuguese. Eu tenho uma pergunta de mim mesmo em português. Você comentou que talvez a gente chegue perto de fazer análises genômicas, com todos os dados genômicos, talvez em vírus. Curiosamente, isso não costuma acontecer, mesmo os genomas dos vírus sendo muito curtos, né, em comparação com o genoma animal, é muito comum que se foque em apenas alguns genes de interesse. E um dos motivos é justamente por causa dos grupos externos. Existe variação do conjunto de genes que compõem esses genomas, então, para se comparar coisas comparáveis, digamos assim, é muito comum, por exemplo, em flavivírus, que se foque apenas em um pedaço do genoma, da poliproteína, ou talvez só nas poliproteínas de um único gênero, porque assim se sabe que é igual e comparável. No caso de coronavírus, é a mesma coisa. São poucos os estudos que usam vários genomas, porque se você sair fora do gênero beta-coronavírus, que é de especial interesse por causa da presença de SARS-CoV, SARS-CoV-2 e MERS-CoV, o conteúdo genético muda e aí também não dá para juntar tudo. Nesses sentidos, nesses casos, é muito comum na virologia usarem, na ausência de grupo externo, uma coisa chamada midpoint routing, né? O enraizamento do ponto no meio. Isso tem muito a ver com a sua palestra. Você tem algum comentário sobre quais que poderiam ser os problemas de se usar midpoint routing no lugar de usar grupos externos?
Eu tenho, na verdade, Denis, eu acho que você que tem experiência direto com isso seria melhor para responder a sua própria pergunta. Midpoint routing, a justificativa de colocar a raiz nesse ponto que maximiza a distância entre os... Não tem nenhuma justificativa teórica para isso. Seria a minha crítica geral. Mas você que vem lidando com isso bastante, eu gostaria de ver ouvir a sua resposta.
Eu fiz as perguntas para você responder, Taran. Você não pode jogar de volta assim, não, cara. Poxa, você que é o convidado. Não, é uma metodologia que pode levar a inferências, inclusive, de clados que não existem, levando a conclusões filogenéticas que não são reais, porque você está colocando a raiz no meio da árvore. E, na verdade, o que você aponta com sua palestra, inclusive, é que existem vários critérios para você utilizar grupos externos. Não existe um motivo real para não utilizá-los, e eles são importantes, independente da dificuldade, do fato de que cada análise é uma análise, e aí cada análise precisa de suas próprias decisões. Não é possível ignorar esse problema e simplesmente enraizar a árvore no meio.
Basicamente, a minha crítica é que não tem nenhuma justificativa teórica para fazer isso. Não tem nenhuma justificativa científica de fazer isso. Tipo, o que a gente está ganhando enraizando nessa posição. Comparar isso com Outgroup Sampling, por exemplo, aí a gente tem justificativa científica, nos objetivos científicos, de que se eu incluo mais taxons, aí eu estou aumentando o poder explicativo e a severidade do teste.
Well, we have a last question from Angelo Pinto. Do you want to read it, Dennis, please?
Oh, yeah, whatever helps. Angelo Pinto is asking, well, I'll quote him. Hi, Taran. How to distinguish in-group instability based on the selection of outgroup from all other potential sources of instability? So again, he's asking, how do we distinguish the instability of the in-group, the topology of the in-group, based on the selection of the outgroup from other things that may be causing in-group instability? The instability may be unrelated to outgroup selection, even if the in-group topology changes for each expansion of the outgroup. This is an affirmation he's making, that this may occur and may not be related to the expansion of the outgroup. Are you assuming that all instability during the expansion of the outgroup selection, I presume, are you assuming that all instability comes from outgroup selection?
So, a hypothetical scenario: if we expand the outgroup repeatedly, in fact, even with that example that I gave, that dendrobated example, there's a node that collapses in the end. It's the same node that always has low support. That basically is instability that does not appear to be due to outgroup sampling, because it's always unstable. So it always has low support, and as outgroup expansion continues, it never stabilizes, and it's always changing. And so effectively what my answer to that is that no, it's not necessarily outgroup selection per se that causes instability. But this is the way of distinguishing between what is due to outgroup instability and what is not. So if outgroup, just go through this sort of, I recognize this is a very convoluted answer, but if outgroup sampling expands and some aspect of, or the entire in-group topology continues being very unstable, then my conclusion as a working scientist would be that I am not going to be able to solve this by expanding the outgroup. That what's required is additional data for the in-group. And so it's in that regard, it's a way of testing how much of the instability in the in-group is due to outgroup sampling and how much of the instability in the in-group is not due to outgroup sampling.
That is fantastic. If I'm not mistaken, these are all the questions that we have. Thank you all for being here and for enjoying this fantastic talks. Thank you, Taran, for your time. I know that these are challenging times for all of our speakers.
Thank you, everyone,
to you and to our speakers today, thank you for putting the time to be here with us today.